Very privileged to introduce our next speakers. These are some amazingly smart guys, and they're doing some really great research and doing some really great work into ICS and SCADA environments. So if I could please join me in welcoming Mr. Robert Lindley and John Lavender.
All right, thank you. So today we want to talk to you about industrial control system, or ICS threat hunting. Industrial control systems, just as we get started, so I don't want to do a whole lot of intro material. Industrial control systems are the type of systems that end up operating a lot of the infrastructure that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Water utilities, power grids, oil and gas refineries, petrochemical facilities. Just think of hardened devices, these physical rugged systems. Some of them are Windows systems. We have Windows systems running, the human-machine interfaces or HMIs of these environments. So the thing that really sets them apart, though, is that ability to impact and control physical environments, right? That sensing and actuating in these environments. That's really what sets them apart. So, little intro. John and I are at a company called Dragos. I also authored the Threat Intelligence class at SANS and the ICS Incident Response and Active Defense class. But most importantly, I write the comic. For anybody that came at the B-Sides presentation, security ending presentation yesterday, you'll have noted that you would have seen little Bobby. I always like to put him in the slides throughout the material. I found at my time in the government that it was really easy to use comics to explain complex topics to congressmen and other senior officials. So I continue that on a weekly basis now. John, go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm John Lavender. As Robin mentioned, I'm at Dragos as well. I am also an avid Starbucks mug collector. If anybody else in the audience is one of those as well. I have kind of it's something I do way too much. But I've also got a pretty thorough background in the U.S. intelligence community. Just recently left back in May, but my background's in everything from red teaming, blue teaming, but I actually met Rob when we were working in the ICS space doing threat intelligence.
Perfect. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about today. First up, we're just going to cover three things. What is threat hunting? How do you start hunting? And specifically, why and how do you do it in ICS environments? So for our first Little Bobby comic, Little Bobby asks, why do people try to redefine active defense to involve intelligence and offensive operations? And Matt says, well, many would like to call those types of operations, or to do those type of operations, but if they call it active defense, it just seems more reasonable to folks. And Little Bobby says, well, fine, doing homework is now defined as playing Minecraft. And I started with this one specifically because with this topic of threat hunting and threat intel and active defense and any other word that we start throwing out, there is a real concern that we start talking and getting into buzzword land, right? So you probably heard that as a theme through a number of different presentations today, but there is real meaning to a lot of the words that we use. At times I find that they get spun out of control, either by vendors, by folks trying to appear to be security experts, or just those folks getting involved in the community. I generally find that nobody's being malicious. Buzzwords generally form because people want to get involved and do something, whether they're on the vendor side or not. But we still have to be careful for them. So we'll return today and talking to those terms and what they actually represent, and not that buzzed out concept that we might have heard over the years.
No, actually, Rob, before you get started,
go ahead.
I want to do the first trivia for today. So,
we have the 4 gifts. So the first one, go ahead.
So the first one's a lockpick by Southward. They were nice enough to donate. So the first trivia question, I'm actually going to refer to Little Bobby comics for those of you who know Rob and have seen Rob have seen him do presentations in the past. If you had to guess, which one would you think Rob represents the most? Little Bobby or the older, mature Matt? I saw your hand first. Perfect. There you go.
Yeah. No, so it was actually modeled after myself as well. So it's easy when you give conference presentations and get involved in places to sort of let your ego get out of check. I like to always return my ego and try to be reasonable-headed. So I like referring to myself as Little Bobby, the kid that doesn't know anything. Since we're all people that are learning, I hate the term expert. There are no experts. So cool. So what is threat hunting? As we go through this, here's our next Little Bobby comic, if you will. And Little Bobby is starting to get a little concerned because he hears all this stuff about cyber war and hype in the community. He says, will people go to war over network security? And Matt says, no, not likely, unless there's some sort of physical and grave damage, maybe, loss of life or something. And Little Bobby says, well, I saw experts saying differently. And Matt said, well, were these experts selling security solutions? And little Bobby said, yeah, and their products look really nice. And what I wanted to note here getting into this next couple topics, and especially with threat hunting, is threat hunting has been around for a long time. It's that human dedicated approach to actually searching for adversaries in your environment. Over the last 2 years, we've seen it sort of go fully to the right in the sense of marketing and presentations and vendor products and things like that. And I just want to note that a lot of the folks selling solutions have typed on hunting when it used to be threat intel, and before that it was just a storage platform, but now it's a hunting platform, and back and forth we see all this jazz take place. I just wanted to note again that there's some real value here that John will start us going off with.
Yeah, and like Rob said, as far as getting value out of tools and different types of platforms, there is definitely an advantage to having them and going with them, but at the same time, a lot of this is a people process. So if we refer to one of the first of, I think, 6 or 7 models that we're going to use in our slides today, the sliding scale of cybersecurity. So just kind of walk through this quickly. If you start with architecture and you start with the simple hygiene facts on a network, you're going to get a lot more value out of doing that as far as being able to do threat hunting later down the road. But it's definitely something to focus on first and up front. And then kind of as you move across the scale, you get into passive defenses. So being able to deploy IDSs, IPSs, different types of platforms or systems on your network, and to be able to take advantage of alerting, data collection, then moving into more of the active defense piece. So as your organization matures, and as you kind of build processes, get people in place, then you're able to do things like active defense, which includes threat hunting. We'll get a little bit more into the active defense piece here in a second, but for those organizations that are able to kind of put all this together and do a very good job of it, then you can see potentially moving down the spectrum a little bit further into actually generating threat intelligence. But very rarely will you ever see an organization going on the offensive. It's definitely a myth. I don't want to say a myth, but it's definitely something that's kind of preached out in the market that isn't exactly something that organizations should do or even have the resources to do.
Yep. And so I just want to add on there as well. One of the reasons I created the model early on and the paper behind it for anybody interested is specifically to push back against the offense discussion. As I've seen sort of the hype in the community take control of what we should be doing next and next gen and next gen or whatever gen we're on, all of these things we're supposed to be doing, I do want to note that we do forget a lot of the basics. And I usually joke around that the key to being a security expert is just renaming the basics into something sexier. But really at the end of the day, we need to stay away from doing the stuff that doesn't return a lot of investment to our organizations. There was a large company that was compromised, that some of you will know its name, but I'll leave them out of it. Large company that was compromised, had millions of dollars in loss, and there was serious boardroom discussions going on about can we go back after the adversaries. And they decided to do so. So there are private companies that are starting to do the whole hack back thing, and they spent millions of dollars to go back after the adversaries, and most of it actually, or a significant portion of it, was in legal fees just to see what they could and couldn't do inside the confines of law. But they spent a lot of time and money doing that, and then you looked at their security organization, and they had 11 people. 11 people on the security staff for a global organization, and 6 of the 11 were management positions. So this is Rob Lee's rule of thumb, that if you have more than a 1-to-1 ratio of managers to analysts, your breach will be embarrassing, okay? So when it comes to what they could have been doing in terms of the security investments that they had, if they would have applied all those resources to hiring and training the staff to start moving along appropriately, it would have been much better for them. One of the reasons we bring this up today is, yes, threat hunting is in that active defense construct, and even though we're both big advocates of it, I would never recommend to an organization that that's the first thing you got to start with. No, get the basics done correctly. Make sure you're patching your systems, logging, taking care of that cyber hygiene stuff, if you will. But don't just jump to training 15 people to go searching for APTs in your network when you're getting hit with unauthenticated requests into your environment. You know, I've seen systems that have had unauthenticated VPNs into a Windows 10 system running PowerShell across the environment while they're trying to deploy next-gen firewalls in some other segment of the network. It's like maybe you should just enable 2-form first, and then we'll start going along. So with that, some other models, if you will.
A couple more models. Actually 3, I think, to be specific. But since the talk is about threat hunting, we'd like to actually apply some models to doing threat hunting itself. So how do you get started with how do you get started down the hunting path? I had a conversation this afternoon with somebody who's doing a little bit of it in his organization, and just listening to, trying to figure out where to get started. It's a very difficult process if you don't have a lot of background and experience in it. And part of this talk will get into hypothesis generation to be able to start doing that. But if you look at applying some models to the actual process itself, we've kind of divided it out both into an active defense portion, which is more the people process, which is more the proactive means of going after and trying to do discovery, trying to do the threat detection, and then figuring out how to clean it up and remediate it. But pairing that with the threat intelligence piece, where there's tons of models available at your fingertips. These are just two that are very common, very widely used in industry. So being able to kind of pair those two together, don't rely too heavily on one or the other, is a good way to kind of build your process around threat. Okay.
Absolutely. I will also note that when I did not make the DIAM model, it's actually a paper, really good paper written by Sergio and crew, called the DIAM model for intrusion analysis. It was a model that we used on the intelligence community side when we were looking at large representations of data across large amounts of intrusions and trying to find out who or where the adversary was and what they were going after. It worked very effectively. It's still something that we use and teach out to today. And of course, you've heard the kill chain before. I will admit, though, when I made the other model, the active cyber defense cycle, that the only reason I threw the word cyber in there was because it made the acronym ACDC, and I thought that was clever. So that's the only real reason for that. But this aspect of seeing what's on the network, finding it, remediating it, looking into trying to uncover the threat, not malware. We usually focus way too much on malware. Malware is not the threat. The human on the other side of the keyboard is the threat. Malware is just one of the capabilities they might or might not deploy. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. So when we talk about hunting, it's kind of hard not to refer to David Bianco at some point. Really, really smart guy. He came up with this hunting maturity model, one that I like to look back to. When we look at hunting, that human approach to finding threats in your environment, there is a scale of maturity to it. On the far left-hand side, when you're not really hunting, that's why it's level 0, but when you're not really doing any hunting, you're just relying on alerting, right? The IDS says something, the firewall says something, the AV says something, and you respond to it. It's not hunting. It's a very reactive approach. And one of the pitfalls in it is that you're probably not taking a lot of data off your environment to begin with anyways. As we move across it, you'll notice that theme, that it's a lot of data collection that's going on. And that's where a lot of organizations get in trouble. That's where a lot of organizations have problems, is how do I get all of the data? How do I get it back into my environment and search through it without paying an arm and a leg and stay on top of the constantly changing environment? In industrial control systems, as we'll talk about later, that is probably one of the biggest challenges in the community, is how do I get data out of control system environments while respecting the safety and reliability concerns of the facility. As we move along as well, you'll not only notice that there's a higher retention of data and a higher need for data, but you will see that you can start relying on indicators of compromise instead when you're just doing sort of the basics. You move along to actually taking processes and models that other people are using and ingesting them on your team. And then at some point actually creating the new analysis procedures, the new analytics to find unknown threats. The last one is one that gives a little bit of a confusion in the industry. You'll note that it says automates the majority of successful data analysis procedures. There are a lot of companies and marketing out right now trying to say automate all of the things that you do for hunting. Just automate everything. That's not hunting. Automation is very important to hunting. You should be automating all of the things that you can, but if you are actually going through an automated process, it in itself is not the hunting because you've taken the person out of the loop. And that's the piece that is obviously core to it. So in effect, when you're at HMM4, what you really should be doing is figuring out everything that it takes you to find the threat that you did, and then automate that away so you don't have to deal with it on your next hunt. So that's actually sort of the process there.
Yeah, it's more of an enabling force and something that allows you to create a repetitive process than actually taking over and doing it for you.
And another thing that we sort of see as problematic is a lot of organizations have the shiny object syndrome, right? They go to the latest, newest thing. And you'll walk in and you'll see an organization that's got a threat hunting team, but they don't have a network operations center, or they don't have a security operations center. But they've already jumped to the far right-hand side of active defense, if you will, to that threat hunting. So be sure not only in this model to sort of stage your maturity, but also against that sliding scale aspect of actually taking care of what's on your network. So this next slide, I wrote it as a joke at first, and then I thought it was actually pretty useful. David Bianco, if anybody knows him, he has this pyramid of pain. You've probably seen it at some point in your life. Talks about hashes and domains and the TTPs and things you can sort of move up for the pyramid of pain for adversaries. So I give you the threat hunting jawbreaker. So the entire idea behind the jawbreaker here is that there are at least 5 things that I see wrong in the industry today that we need to sort of adapt to when it comes to hunting if we really want to embody what it means to be a threat hunter. So these 4 things, in addition to the 5th at the top, that we see problematic. Number 1, it has to rely on the people. And this is really hard for a lot of organizations to understand. They'll usually try to take somebody that's new, throw them into a job that's threat hunting, and then be disappointed when they don't get a lot of value out of them. It really is a specialty to do threat hunting. You should have some sort of specialty that you bring to the table. An incident responder, security operations folks, somebody who knows Mac forensics if you're a big Mac environment, somebody who knows how to do IR across the enterprise, someone who knows how to do SIM alerting. Different specialties are ultimately coming together, both red and blue team, onto the same team to do these threat hunting approaches. The second one is your job focuses on those human adversaries. You should be finding them, but you might not. And that's actually one of the most depressing aspects here. So I had a customer that set up a beautiful network. They were doing a security operations center for a gas pipeline, and it was a really, really good environment. They had whitelisting across the environment. They had every bit of monitoring they could have, full packet capture from everywhere inside of the ICS. It was a beautiful setup. And this guy had trained and trained and trained he and his staff. And it was, by all accounts, a very impressive organization overall. And then they saw nothing and continued to see nothing. They actually locked down their facility very well inside of the confines of the ICS. They never got to see the big bad APT that they kept hearing about in the news and everywhere else. And that was almost disheartening to that staff. And it's also very hard to do retention of people when someone trains up to be this threat hunter and they sort of embody this and think it's going to be awesome, and then find out that their job relies on the adversary being there. And again, that can be sort of problematic. We've seen that even in the news where FireEye has done a lot of good stuff in the community, and then you see discussions about, China's not coming after portions of the government anymore, which is debatable, but a significant portion of the Chinese activity falls off. Well, that's going to have a significant impact to all the people at FireEye who were focusing on Chinese threats. So our adversary-defender relationship is much more of a bi-directional relationship than most people realize. The next one there is I wanted to note that you need to be open-minded, but you can't be a new person. So going back to that kind of original discussion, I don't think threat hunting is the place to drop your new analysts. I really think they should get familiar with your organization. They should build up their security skills. They should develop a specialty, find what's interesting to them, and then be able to come over to that style of team. But they have to be open-minded. So we had an analyst that worked with us back in the intelligence community. He was a Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps. Definitely did not belong there. By any stretch of the imagination, did not belong on the team. That sounds harsh, but he was a new person and we were doing more advanced stuff. So he went off, just got some training, tried to get some specialties, came back, still disheartened, still a new guy. And I'll sort of note to you that the questions he asked, even though he wasn't able to investigate everything that he was supposed to, even though he wasn't able to uncover everything that we needed him to do with the tools we had, the questions he asked as that new person was more impactful than anybody else on the team. That open-mindedness that he had of not really understanding why the world worked in specific ways, he started asking those questions that revealed adversary data we never thought to look for. So I don't want to be discouraging to the new folks. We need more of them. We need a lot of them, and I think they have a huge value in an organization. But for the benefit of your new folks, I would like to see less plopping down in a threat hunting team to start off with.
You could always pair them up. Like if you're trying to get them more expertise, or you want to get them to work with your senior folks that have a lot of experience, it's helpful to let them do shadowing for a week or sit down on certain types of processes in the hunting process.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll also note sort of your next one there is that product vendors will pitch hunting, but it's not about the product. It is that human focus. So we see a lot of products in the market right now about hunting platforms, as an example. There's really no such thing. And a lot of us can sit down and be like, well, there's hunting platform because this, that. No, you're really just talking about different tools to enable data access, analytics, and automation. That's great, and that's useful. but really the hunting itself is focused on that human person. So we can relabel things in the industry if it gets people to use them. That's fantastic. But at its core, just remember it's always central to that person. And then, of course, as we hit on already, you need to rely on automation, but you can't fully automate hunting. All right, so how do we start? So the CISO here says to little Bobby, I need to ensure that no attacks occur. And little Bobby says, cool, what's the security budget? And the CISO says, no, we had to cut it all out. So little Bobby says, well, I assure you we will never see any attacks. So when it comes to starting to hunt, a lot of it is just initiating what you're doing, but it's nice to actually have a guided approach. So these next couple slides, we're going to go through how to do hypothesis generation. A hypothesis is nothing more than a testable idea you come up with, and it really is central to hunting. It's how you should start a good hunt, coming up with an idea of what the adversary might be doing in your environment or where they might be located, because that's going to drive how you do collection in the environment. Am I pulling registry keys or am I pulling memory samples? Well, if I think that they're doing a rootkit in the registry to remain persistent, well, then it's going to be really important for me to grab that registry key. So we'll see how that sort of takes hold.
Actually, before we jump, let's do another trivia. I'm going to be the trivia guy today, I guess. So, for those of you, I guess, has anybody in the audience ever been involved in threat hunting or done hunting in their environments? Show of hands.
Perfect.
Cool, we got some. All right, so let's go with, we have listed 3 specific kind of genres of hypothesis generation. And before we jump to that slide, I'm going to see if anybody has an idea of what one of them might be. So I am.
Yeah, all right. So, intelligence-driven hunting is absolutely one of them. One of the ways that you can generate intelligence, and I'll go ahead and flip as John's walking. One of the ways you can generate hypotheses will usually come off of either threat intelligence or friendly intelligence. We often leave out that friendly construct. If your forces, your blue team, are doing something in your environment, what they're doing and how they're doing it might encourage you to hunt differently. So we're going to walk through some examples of these coming up. We'll just walk through the generation aspect itself. We also have domain expertise. At the end of the day, there's always that something that hunters have or experienced security folks have, and it's kind of hard to put your finger on it. I would usually rely that or sort of say that would be domain expertise. It's something either from your past job or from your current job, and over time you've learned tradecraft, you've learned adversary capabilities, even without intelligence, even without any prompt to do so, you've learned something that you're going to bring with you into generating hypotheses. So that is what I would refer to as domain expertise. As
an example of that, there was a guy that Rob and I worked with when we were back in the government who he would come and sit down beside of us as we were going through either looking at network traffic or just doing some sort of investigation. And he'd be able to sit there and just kind of like tilt his head a little bit. And he's like, that smells like it's X and X actor or somebody who's done this in the past. And 9 times out of 10, the guy was actually right, which was just odd. He'd been doing this for so long. For him, it was like staring at the matrix with a little, with the numbers and letters falling down. He would just kind of point, and then we would start investigating down that road. But just having those people, like if you guys know those people, or if you guys are those people, it's very helpful to get up and share that with the rest of your team, share that with the community. But that's definitely I'd say that's probably one of the biggest drivers for being able to generate a hypothesis and actually make it come to real, or be able to test it and find out that it's actually true or is actually happening in your environment.
And then the next one I would say is situational awareness. And this is really on understanding your own organizations. But I would drive you not to just think about tech, and this is going to come in a big way with the ICS. It's not just about the networks, it's about the overall systems and organization and people around it. Do we have things going on at a macro level that are going to influence what we're seeing on the network? I would pontificate to you that Saudi Aramco, the oil and gas company in Saudi Arabia, has a different threat landscape than JP Morgan does. Different threat actors, different capabilities, different things coming after them. Situational awareness around those things, not from a threat intelligence perspective, but just from understanding your own organization, is going to drive how you generate those hypotheses. So let's step through a couple of these examples. The first one here is this threat intelligence inspired hypotheses. So maybe we've got this Sparkling Panda group. No, Sparkling Panda is not a real one. I just like all the little names that always come up like Jedi Squirrel and stuff. But Sparkling Panda, utilizing Seychelles-based C2 servers. So most of you probably, I don't know if you've ever heard of the country of Seychelles, but it's probably not common in your environment. So if you reached in and you found in this intelligence report that you were consuming, that there are Seychelles-based C2 servers for this adversary, it would be reasonable to generate a hypothesis that if Seychelles or if the Sparkling Panda actor is in your environment, you would expect to see IPs or domains and proxy logs of your environment related to Seychelles. So that's how you're going to hunt for that a little bit differently. But you've got to have that testing to make it a hypothesis, right? So it's not just the good idea fairy on the team, it's actually going and testing it. At that testing stage, you might actually pull the proxy logs, understand the data flows, and try to evaluate what you see in the environment. And again, this is really where we bridge the gap that it's not just IR, it's not just security operations, it's a senior individual who really understands how to explore and test a theory in your own environment related to what the adversary activity might be.
And that also has the technology and the data to help support those as well. Another example with the situational awareness inspired hypothesis. So let's say you're working for a large company or a small company for that matter, and you know there's a merger about to happen, and your company is acquiring a globally distributed company that you know networks are going to have to be integrated over the next 6 months. If you kind of took that into your thought process, made an assumption or a hypothesis that says, I'm pretty sure that whatever networks we're taking on, there's either already an infection in it, or it's going to introduce some sort of vulnerability to our environment. And being able to test that by identifying how that network is going to be attached to your current network, whether or not you're going to re-architect or do reconfiguration, but being able to identify the choke points that you need, the types of data that you need, flow data, to be able to actually prove that hypothesis that if something malicious is going on into the network that you're bringing into yours, you're going to be able to find that out ahead of time.
And then for an example of the domain expertise, maybe an analyst understands industrial control systems very well. So they understand how they interact, they understand what normal and abnormal looks like. From that specialty that they brought to the table, from that domain expertise, they generate a hypothesis that there's likely new function codes going on in something like a Modbus TCP or DMP3 protocol that was going on in their environment and it's adversary related. So they generate this hypothesis that there will be abnormal and potentially harmful function codes in the protocols themselves. That ability to then test it is going to require them to know how to get data off the environment effectively, pull some packet capture, understand the protocols well enough to break them out past a Wireshark dissector trying to understand it for them, and then determining the legitimacy of those function codes itself. So that's sort of a process that they might go through. And if you think about it, it sounds very simplistic at that high level. But think about all of the components that go into actually testing it. That's where a lot of folks get sort of in trouble. And another flaw that I see with a lot of more junior hunters is they'll start off thinking about the test phase more than anything else. They get so technical that they think, I want to pull PCAP, I want to pull log, I want to pull proxies. And they never came up with a really good idea about why they were doing that in the first place. That, in a lot of circles, can influence what government circles will call the self-licking ice cream cone. It's where they do stuff over and over again that's really not benefiting anybody, but they think they're doing the right thing, and well, darn it, licking that ice cream cone sure does feel good. So let's jump into the ICS portion. So little Bobby here says, is it unfair that China is always getting blamed for computer breaches? And Matt says, yeah, other countries do the same or similar activities, and you know what? We have to keep an open mind and keep critical of the data. Little Bobby says, okay, so which country is most responsible then? He goes, China. So I do want to note that, as we start talking about the industrial control system aspect, one of the things that I really want to leave you with is we do not fully understand the ICS threat landscape. There's a lot of reporting. There's a lot of folks doing some good work in the community. We fully don't understand what's going on in these environments. So to sort of articulate this usually is a pretty good slide to do so from the ICS CERT's annual reporting.
Can anybody pick out what's wrong with this first graph? Or what would stick out in your mind? So, exactly.
Yeah, so for the rest of the audience, what he noted was the high percentage of unknown. Every single year when these metrics come out, and I wouldn't say they're the best metrics, but they are the authoritative ones in the community in terms of a central repository. Every single year, the number one attack vector into ICS is unknown. So they have no idea how it got there, let alone if they're actually cleaning it up correctly. If you didn't know what the infection vector was, it would be very hard to say with a matter of fact that you actually cleaned it up. The second highest attack vector into an ICS every year, spear phishing. What's wrong with that? That's absolutely on the business side of the network. We don't have email servers inside of a SCADA environment. So when we see stuff get into an ICS, we're detecting it in the business networks coming through the DMZ, not in the ICS itself. And when we actually do understand what the attack vector is, it's something like a spear phishing email, which we don't have on the ICS side itself as well. So I would push off to you that even though we've got a lot of people doing some really good work in the community, we're not historically getting into those environments and collecting data and understanding what's going on. As another way to sort of break this down, when we think of those big vendors who have threat intelligence, it's not just indicators of compromise, right? It's that understanding of patterns of malicious data related to adversary intrusions. What we're seeing, though, is the big companies that are AV companies or incident response companies, the folks who have had access to intrusion data into lots of companies. And they're able to extract out those patterns and knowledge. In ICS, there is no such thing. There are no teams out there, no companies, ours included, nobody who has a large repository of incident response data in ICS environments. Community doesn't like to share. And at the same time, we have not historically had antivirus and IDSs and things reporting out in industrial control system environments, so none of the vendors actually have everything that you would hope they would have that they historically have done for IT networks. So it's one of the gaps that we have, and one of the reasons that threat hunting specifically is so important, and that open-mindedness is so important in ICS environments, because we're coming up against things that we do not know what to expect.
It kind of plays back to that sliding scale of being able to kind of start from the basics of the architecture and the infrastructure piece and build that out. So we're noticing that it's happened, and it's been happening for a long time on the IT side, but on the OT side, it's really becoming more of a the awareness is really being raised, I guess, in the marketplace for it. And certain facilities and companies are definitely taking it on.
Absolutely. So let's take two fake case studies, or two case studies that I would call hype, and then we'll look at some real ones. So I've got some real case studies from incident response we'll take a look at. So this one was one of the first ones that gained a lot of media attention. So 2010, I couldn't make it through an ICS presentation without saying the word Stuxnet. 2010, Stuxnet happened in Iran. Everyone was like, wow, SCADA's a thing. And people started getting interested. So in 2011, when we heard about a potential other breach, it made national level news. And there was this water facility in Illinois that potentially got compromised, and the State Fusion Center put out a report that said a Russian cyber attack took down a water pump in Illinois, which if that was the big bang thing that we were waiting for, like a single water pump failing in a water utility, like we won, congratulations. But everyone was concerned about it. What it turns out that it was the contractor learned from the national media reporting about the incident. And the contractor was the one that remoted in to the environment while on vacation in Russia. And remoted into the environment and made some changes, and then like 3 months later, the pump failed. And so the analysts on scene were like, wow, Russian IP address in the logs from 3 months ago, and a pump just failed. Obviously, those things are related. Obviously, that's a misapplication of a causal analysis. They're not related. But you can see that a lot of people wanting to do good in these environments and maybe not fully understanding the environments themselves report a little bit of hype that gets pushed out there in the community. Probably one of the bigger cases that's very hard to kill is the BTC pipeline case. So in 2008, the BTC pipeline in Turkey was attacked. There was an attack on it, and there was an explosion. And at the time, the Turkish government reached out and said, it was these extremists. And the extremists replied, yep, it was us. And then 7 years later, Bloomberg came out with a big article in the media that said, nope, it was a cyber attack and it was the Russians. And the problem with that, I don't blame the reporters for this. I don't think they were doing necessarily hurtful things on purpose. But part of the problem with this was that incident responders misled them into believing that this was a thing, and they didn't understand the environments well enough. They're not industrial control system experts to push back on all the things that were being said and didn't make sense in the environment. As an example, the story goes that the adversary found internet-connected surveillance equipment that was monitoring the control system environment. They compromised the internet-connected surveillance equipment. They pivoted over into the control center. They blocked the satellite communications that the control center had as a backup relay. They went down to the compressor stations, and they changed the alerting, and they changed the pressure on the compressor stations to allow the pipeline to blow up. And 3 days later, it did. The problem with that story, besides the fact that there's just no way they got logs from that environment, one of the incident responders said that they pulled syslog from the type of controllers that were in that facility, except for those type of controllers didn't have syslog even as a feature you could enable until 2013, so it definitely wasn't taking place in 2008. The other thing that really sort of set everything apart was the Turkish government had installed the cameras after the attack in response to the attack. So it couldn't have been the attack vector. And of course we had TNT and like wrench marks and physical cameras understanding that extremists had come up to the pipeline. But you can again see how it's very, very sort of prolific that hype will generate in this community very quickly when people are interested, obviously, in things like national infrastructure. So to explain what a cyber attack in an ICS actually looks like, and a little bit of repeat from yesterday, but we'll bring it to a new point. I developed a model called the ICS cyber kill chain. So John's going to walk us through it here.
So out of curiosity, how many people know of the cyber kill chain?
The regular one, yeah.
It's
the
traditional, the one being represented here. So all of these phases, all of these actions still take place. It's not anything magically different in an ICS environment, with the exception of when you're actually talking about being able to have influence, being able to either manipulate or take down or deny in an actual control system. You're going to have to do a bit more work than just getting a footprint and getting a foothold and keeping that foothold into an environment. So the actual piece that we wanted to kind of highlight is the second phase of that, when you're actually being able to either exfil data out of an environment to learn about what's happening in that. So when you get into actual control systems, a lot of the red teams and a lot of nation states might not necessarily have the expertise to go in and turn off a water pump, turn off a generator, just because they simply don't know how it works. They don't know what protocols are driving it. They don't know what function codes are going to actually make it turn off. And what they don't want to do is basically just shut everything down and lose their access. So being able to define the steps and the extra work and just the amount of resources that it takes to be able to have an actual defined effect in an ICS environment, it's very, very challenging. You step through the phases of, once you get in, get a foothold, being able to actually develop and test your attack, or be able to test what kind of effect you're trying to have in the environment, and then being able to actually deliver that and carry it out in a successful manner. A lot of these environments are, I wouldn't say unstable, but a simple flip of a bit could change the entire process of what happens, could change the entire control system itself. So being able to actually do that correctly is extremely challenging.
And I would add on here as well, when you think of a control system, most people think, well, it's very insecure. Well, if you gave me a control system, I could turn it off. You just connect to the network and I'll turn it off. That's entirely true. I guarantee you I could put a PLC on a network in this environment and every one of you could figure out a way to screw with it. No problem. But to understand the physical process that's going on and understand the larger system, not that individual system, is actually very difficult, especially remotely over something like packet capture. So if you wanted to, let's take a water distribution facility as an example. If you wanted to take a water distribution facility and overflow the tanks, you might find a human-machine interface that says, like, drive more water to this location, pump water, done. And if you would click on that as the attacker, nothing would happen. You're thinking, like, why wouldn't it? Well, because there's altitude valves at that location. And they're physical devices that aren't networked and they aren't connected to the network, and you wouldn't understand that without understanding the engineering behind the system. And those altitude valves say, hey, there's already too much water in the tank. So if any more water tries to get pumped, we're just going to flip the valve and it's going to be bypassed at some other location. Understand that physical aspect is more engineering than it is cyber prowess. So for an adversary, they've got to step through more. So we think about this for a second. I'm going to flip back and forth. What that basically says in an ICS is we have an extended kill chain. There is a longer amount of time adversaries have to persist in our environments and more steps they have to achieve to have a reliable effect inside of that environment. So let's take a case study of this. Ukraine ends up being a perfect case study. I was fortunate enough to be one of the investigators on the Ukraine attack. The report that I wrote out at SAMS that went out to the community is up in the top there. So what essentially happened is December 23rd, 2015, a cyber attack took down portions of the Ukrainian power grid, specifically 3 different regions. 6 months before that, adversaries sent phishing emails. They did the sort of the normal things. Sent phishing emails, had a Word document. The Word document had macros on it. The email was like, hey guys, do you want some more features? Just enable macros. And people were like, I totally want more features. Click. And Black Energy 3 dropped the system. Black Energy 3 started siphoning off information, especially related to the user credentials associated with the VPNs. From there, the adversaries used the VPNs to get into the ICS environment. While there, they spent the majority of that 6 months learning that environment, understanding how it worked. Each one of those Oblanergos or control centers had a different distribution management system. So they learned how to interact on those 3 different distribution management systems. When it came time for the attack, they had also identified that there were serial to Ethernet gateways. The serial to Ethernet gateways communicate the Ethernet-based protocols, the control center, to the physically separated serial running control systems at the substations. So it acts as a bridge between the control center and the substation. So they found that, and they developed malicious firmware for each one of those devices so that when it came time for the attack, they went down and used the distribution management system against the ICS. It wasn't malware that took down the power plant or power in that environment. They used the system itself against itself. Then they blew the bridges by doing the firmware updates to the serial to Ethernet devices, which left the responders unable to remotely access those control environments. They had to send people out to each one of them to manually operate portions of the grid to return electricity back on. And in addition, just because why not, they went through the environment, found network-connected UPS devices, and then shut those to go offline and drop the interface so that power would go out in the control center as well. And then they launched the denial of telephone service against all the call centers. So a lot of stuff going on for these defenders, and they actually responded and did very well. Let's talk about the sort of the hunting aspects of it. You know, for these ICS environments, there's a lot of smaller, more static environments that we deal with. Data collection and good hypothesis generation are 2 of the most important things to get through. Because once you have the data, there's a lot of things that will stand out as abnormal. As an example, in the environment, if you had Black Energy 3 deployed that actually made it into the ICS, you'd find that one of the first things it does is reach out to Microsoft.com, MSDN.com, Bing.com, things like that all malware does, or most malware does, for internet checking. The problem is, there's no way that would happen in an ICS normally. Shouldn't have internet checking going on inside of the ICS. We shouldn't ever see Bing.com in an ICS. If you ever see Bing.com in an ICS, you are compromised, okay? There's your number 1 hunting tactic. Same thing here. We see it's going over NTP, but NTP, Network Time Protocol, right? So we're trying to get time checks, except in most ICS locations, we utilize GPS because we need very high reliability of time synchronization. So we definitely wouldn't be going to Microsoft.com to get the time server. We'd do an internal time server that was likely linked up to GPS. Very simple things that would stand out if you had the situational awareness or the domain expertise of that environment. In terms of the chart over here, that is a simple I/O chart of doing a remote firmware update across the control system network. Does anybody without me explaining what control systems are on the network, can you spot the firmware update? Right? It should be kind of obvious. I'm not even going to give out anything for this because I would hope everyone would understand that there's a big jump in the I/O and the bandwidth on this network. These networks aren't doing things that normal enterprise networks do. I wouldn't expect to see a controller going out to Twitter and using B-size Augusta hashtags, right? So it has very set patterns and data flows and things that it's doing. All right, so let's take another one as an example.
Cool, another case study that we have. So there was a utility we went out to they had identified, they had configured running on the network, just like just about every other organization in the world. They found out, well, they weren't able to determine the actual infection vector, why it was there in the first place. They tried remediating it. It kept coming back, and they just couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. So as part of the process of actually trying to help them do that, trying to hunt, we started with the hypothesis generation. So we've listed 3 up here on the board. Basically, the customer was infecting themselves. Either the vendor was remoting in, and for some reason the vendor was infected and they were passing that on as well, or maybe they had some sort of transient or mobile devices that were coming and going from the network that were infected. And I guess based on the picture of matter and cars up here, if anybody could take a guess as to which one of these hypotheses was correct, we have a prize to give away. This is
all right, so raise your hands. All right, yes. Oh, the first one. So the customer's infecting themselves. That's not it. Next. There's like everybody had their hands up. I'm going to go with you in the blue because you're like right in front of me. Yeah. No, it was not the vendor, so we're going to hold off on this one. Great job. No. So what it ended up being in this environment is that all those are very reasonable, and those happen all the time. The person's infecting themselves or the vendor's doing it. We see a lot of those infections. But actually, it was the fact that at this facility, they had line trucks that used Windows XP embedded systems, and they were connected to the Wi-Fi. And so the incident responders would come down, remote in, clean up the configure on the network. The trucks would drive away. they clean everything up, they leave, and the trucks would drive back like a Benny Hill theme song and infect the network, right? So that was unfortunate for them. But it was important to understand going through that process of hypothesis generation, but not only what's most likely, which these two folks got, those would be the most likely ones, but also the type of data and the type of collection and the type of logs and system analysis you would need to determine what was the actual infection vector. Just think about what all goes into doing that. All right, so let's take another one. I used this one yesterday, but this has got to be my favorite one. So we had this Nordic wind farm. So this wind farm somewhere in the north was operating the turbines you see here, or some similar ones, and each one of these turbines, they have Windows embedded or Windows systems operating, and they just have like nice little terminals for them. And they had this problem that they were seeing abnormal behavior. So what was the detection vector, the abnormal behavior they were seeing? Well, the systems were patching themselves. Definitely weird, right? So nobody was initiating patching in the environment, yet the systems themselves were being patched and maintained. So these hypotheses were generated. Maybe IT wasn't communicating to the operations technology folks, and they were just going out and doing patching, which is entirely likely. Or rogue operators were patching the systems, like bad guys were breaking in and they just wanted to be super friendly. Or it was actually the adversaries themselves, not your rogue folks inside your company, doing the patching of the system. Oh, okay, we'll do another one then. All right, which one was it? Yeah, all right, adversaries patching themselves. All right, got it, nailed it. All right, woo! So what this ended up being was the adversaries had gotten in the environment and found out that this was a perfect environment to do Bitcoin mining. And they were using the spare process space to do Bitcoin mining on these systems, and as a way to defend it against other adversaries, they were keeping the systems patched and maintained. Now, there is a sad part. Yeah, go ahead. Change control. Caught via change control, absolutely. The downside is, despite all of the recommendations possible, they decided to leave the adversary. Yeah, I'll let that sink in for a second. They decided that the adversary is patching their systems more effectively with less failures in their IT department, so they left them. Don't do that. All right. All right, so we got another one here as well to just go through and start closing out here. So this was a naval ship. There's a small reference to it in the public community, but this one's not very much discussed. But there was a non-U.S. based naval ship that had sensitive control systems that went offline. They lost access to portions of the control network. And so when trying to figure out what malware was involved and what was causing it, they generated some hypotheses. One of the hypotheses was direct interaction from the adversary over remote connection via the satellite communications. Somebody actually came in, interacted with the systems, took them down. That's a scary thing, especially if you're on a ship, right? The second thing was that an operator plugged in a USB and infected the network, and the malware spreading around took down sensitive control systems. And the third was that targeted malware embedded in the supply chain, right, embedded in the control system themselves, finally activated. So we went through this process, and what they ended up recovering, this was not one that we actually got to be involved with, but what they ended up uncovering was that it was just simply the operator. But to understand that, they had to go and pull registry keys, they had to understand the USB plugins, where they were being plugged in around the environment, and they had to track down the USB and figure out what malware was on it so they could analyze the initial infection vector. Again, from simple hypothesis generation, each one of these are going to take you down a different path of collection and a different path of adversary activity. Now, once you figure out any of the ones that we went through, you can figure out remediation of that. You can automate that process out of either detecting or blocking that activity in the future. And that's what a good hunter should and will do. They'll automate their previous hunts if you're at that mature level, so you don't have to do this every single time. We don't want to play whack-a-mole. We want to continually push our security to get better and better in our environments. So we'll leave you with some of the sample hypotheses, and then we'll do a recap and exit out here. So go ahead, John.
Sure. So in an ICS environment, and I think we mentioned a lot of these already, but in a typical control system environment, you might not necessarily want to see or should see internet traffic. So it's a pretty simple thing to detect. As long as you're looking for it, you're set up to do collection and actually monitor to see if it's happening or not. But it could be a very, very big indicator that something bad is happening in your environment, and a pretty quick way to go back and actually trace it down to figure out what's going on.
Bing.com. Okay, yep. Yeah. So another one is adversary. Well, one hypothesis I usually operate under is that adversaries will gravitate towards the HMI, the human-machine interface. So it would be very difficult to learn the process, the physical things that are ongoing without things like engineering documents. But one easy thing is a human-machine interface. It'll show you the layout of the facility, everything that's ongoing. Is it a water facility? Is it an electric facility? What type of systems are they using? So you get a lot of information. And also, it's not some weird embedded system. It's usually a Windows system that adversaries are typically used to. and that system that can actually interact with and operate the environment. So a good hypothesis is that if you have an infection, you might want to start at the HMI first.
Patching and updating, like one of the case studies that we said, in a control system environment's usually very, very well organized and planned out. Having downtime in a production environment is usually kept to minimal, and is done in very controlled manner. So if you think about patching happening or updates happening that aren't scheduled or that either haven't been fully tested, so a lot of times you'll run older firmware on old devices, specifically because if you update them, they might not work in your environment. So all that stuff's very controlled. So if you're generating a hypothesis that if I see updates, I see patches, that's probably malicious, or that's something that's out of the normal that we should look into.
Yeah, another one would be an adversary on the network exfiltrating out process and storing data. So my hypothesis is, if I've got an adversary on the network, they're exfilling out process and storing data. So I'd have to figure out where on the network I could collect, where I could actually put in some sort of monitoring capabilities to pull off packet capture or flow data, and then go through and check in my process and storing data if I'm seeing more of that system beaconing out or communicating out of the network. That process of storing is going to tell me what everything that is physical in the environment is doing, tell me things like frequency or water levels or things like that an adversary would need to know if they wanted to achieve a stage 2 style attack.
And then if we refer back to the ICS kill chain model, the first phase that's built into the second stage is doing your reconnaissance, doing your background check, doing your reconnaissance and basically learning the environment that you're in or trying to get into. So a lot of times we'll go out and label, or we'll generate a hypothesis that says wherever we keep our engineering documents is probably a very likely target for an adversary, and be able to set up monitoring around that.
And the interesting thing there is in a lot of environments, your engineering documents aren't on the ICS. So you'll actually find that your engineering documents could even be in contractor networks and third-party networks. So is your ICS security staff getting notified if the contractor gets compromised and they lose engineering documents related to your infrastructure? Is your integrator compromised? How might that be affecting you if an adversary is trying to come after you? That two-stage kill chain doesn't have to happen just in your environment. So in recap, threat hunting is a process of humans actively searching for adversaries in their systems. It is a very human-based process. Threat hunting itself falls in that active defense category. Good threat hunting begins with a hypothesis, a testable idea. It's going to drive how you do everything else in that environment. And then lastly, hunting for threats in an ICS is absolutely important, not for security aspects necessarily, but for improving the safety and reliability of those operations. So we have little Bobby here, and I use this one specifically because you're always concerned as a speaker what people take away from you saying. So I wanted to note a little Bobby one that he doesn't quite take away the right thing. Little Bobby says, Matt, can you virtualize the SCADA system? Matt's like, absolutely. You know, engineering workstations, operating stations, the actual supervisory stuff that's Windows-based, totally. You can absolutely do that and help out with incident response, help out with a lot of things. And little Bobby says, cool, so virtual SCADA in the cloud. And Matt says, no, that's not what I meant at all. So with that, and I have to do one more little Bobby as we're giving away everything here. Matt, an expert, says I have to change my security approach. Matt says, well, who called an expert? Well, he did. Experts are people that are recognized by their peers, not necessarily themselves. Little Bobby says, yeah, but it also said so in his Twitter bio. Matt says, even worse. So no matter who tells you anything, ourselves included, always be skeptical at least enough to go research it. We've got a lot of fantastic people in the community doing some great things, a lot of good research. Always do your own research on top of it, though. I've got the Car Hacker's Handbook here, donated by No Starch Press. Let's give this one away. Name me the 3 types of hypotheses that we discussed. Sir. Yep, so domain expertise, friendly or threat intelligence, and then the situational awareness. So give him a round of applause, and thank you so much for